Hey everyone, this is Robin Ortega from your Diplomatic History course. Today's presentation, among other things, will attempt to explain, in at least a broad fashion, why the United States ultimately rejected the Treaty of Versailles following the armistice of the First World War, and how it would lead to the Treaty of Berlin in 1921. Let's begin. Our learning objectives for this presentation will also encompass events that surrounded the Versailles Treaty, in hopes of gaining a better understanding of the treaty and its place in the First World War. We should first familiarize ourselves with some important events that precipitated the treaty. Primarily, what were the events that brought on the beginning of the First World War? And also, what hidden alliances were in place that became the catalysts that threw European countries into the war? Next, we also want to consider President Wilson's 14 points that preceded the Treaty of Versailles, especially the leniency it granted Germany in terms of negotiating an end to the war. Finally, we will examine the Versailles Treaty's main concepts, its rejection of senatorial approval, Wilson's counterattacks to gain its acceptance, and ultimately, what may have been some of the consequences brought on by its rejection on the world level. Now, what ultimately initiates the start of the First World War was an event that occurred in the summer of 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria had been traveling in Sarajevo when he was assassinated by Serb nationalists. Now, we should remember at the time Sarajevo was under the control of Austrian power, and these Serb nationalists hoped that his assassination would supplant the Austrian rule. His assassination served as a secret network of alliances among prominent nations in Europe. When Austria mobilized against the Serbian nationalists as a response to the killing of Ferdinand, Russia, having an alliance emotionally and militarily with these Serbians, mobilized against Austria. Germany, having a similar alliance with Austria, would ultimately mobilize its forces to aid Austria against the Russians. And finally, France, hoping to somewhat contain Germany's borders on the Western Front, mobilized its forces with Russia to fight against Austria and Germany, bringing forward the First World War. America, surprisingly relatively late in the game, did not become directly involved in the war against the Central Powers until 1917. We should note that at the start of the war, President Wilson had urged Americans to remain neutral to the events developing in Europe. Two primary events would ultimately get American forces involved in the war against Germany and its allies. The first of these events was the unrestricted submarine warfare on ships that held American tourists by German submarines, specifically the sinking of the Lusitania, Sussex, and the Arabic, even though both British and Germany interfered with U.S. shipping during the early years of the war. The British had not escalated their tactics to the sinking of ships. The final event, and what most likely gave Wilson the pretext to officially declare war, was the Zimmermann telegram. Intercepted by British intelligence, this telegram was sent by Germany to Mexico, asking the Mexican government to declare war on the Americans, preventing the Americans to completely commit their forces in Europe. If successful, Germany would promise that the land lost to Americans from the Mexican-American War in the 1840s would be returned to Mexico following the war. These two events, though not the only events that led America to get involved under the American Expeditionary Force, propelled the Americans to become totally involved against other Allied forces, with other Allied forces against the Central Powers. Now, Wilson's 14 points, though not totally implemented as a solution to the closing negotiations of the war, would play a significant role in what would be the armistice between the Allied and Central Powers at the end of 1918. German leaders had paid close attention to Wilson's points and realized that the 14 points would provide significant leniency for the repercussions Germany would face after the war. Nonetheless, Wilson's 14 points of 1918 would hope to make the world a safe place to live in, particularly, according to Wilson, that its implementation would make the world a safe place for every peace-loving nation. 7 of the 14 points would call for specific territorial changes after the war, and the Germans would have subject nations taken from them. Furthermore, an independent Poland with access to the sea would be made up of lands taken from Germany, Austria, and Russia. Aside these first 7 points, the capstone of Wilson's 14 points was the creation of a League of Nations. The League would supervise the disarmament of the involved nations, aid in the progression towards the independence of colonies taken from the Central Powers, as well as the self-determination of these foreign countries, and would also implement collective security where if no one nation attacked another, all nations in this league would be obligated to aid the nation on the defense. As previously stated, the leniency of Wilson's 14 points were viewed by the Germans as ultimately less intrusive to their conclusion of the First World War. And by the time the Versailles Treaty was sent to Germany for an agreement, many Germans believed that Wilson had gone against his word. As we will soon find out, the Versailles Treaty would produce much more stringent repercussions for Germany. Hoping to regain lost ground and turn the tide before American forces arrived in the West, German forces conducted one final offensive against Allied forces. Surprising to the Central Powers, America was able to mobilize relatively quickly and effectively force the Germans to agree on an armistice in 1918. By 1919, Wilson and the Allied forces began talks in Paris to begin an end to the war. However, unlike Wilson's 14 points, the Versailles Treaty would result in much harsher conclusions and reparations for the Germans. France and Britain had succeeded in persuading Wilson, who had at the time hoped to achieve an equitable solution between the Allies and Central Powers, and excluding the Germans from sitting at the negotiating table. The treaty that would rise from the Versailles Conference would completely blame and punish Germany for the consequences of the war. Though Wilson conceded much to the Allies, he would be successful in the implementation of the League of Nations as part of the treaty. The three takeaways of the Versailles Treaty included the following: a war guilt clause that would force Germany to accept the guilt and responsibility of the war, as well as forcing Germany to foot the bill of the war. B, a loss of German territory in Poland and France. And finally, C, the formation of Wilson's League of Nations, which would accomplish A, solve any problems that may come up and could amend the outcome of the treaty to keep the Germans content. And finally, a collective security war, as I mentioned before, would ensure the protection of all of the nations in the League against each other. This portion, as we will see, would become highly refuted as Americans opposed the possibility of diminishing American sovereignty, as well as the possibility of entangling American forces in foreign affairs. So this cartoon is, as you can see, a cartoon depicting Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander of the First World War, holding what is essentially the treaty's terms to a German soldier that reads, "Terms: the German people must pay for all damage to civilians on land or sea or from the air." Essentially, the Versailles Treaty was placing all the blame in every theater of the war on the Germans. And of course, there's no shortage of political cartoons that express these same views, specifically held by French and the British. Now, opposition to the Versailles Treaty did not start when Wilson returned home from the conclusion of the treaty's conference. Many were simply opposed from the start because President Wilson brought on only one registered Republican, Henry White, the former ambassador to Italy, who was not a significant player in the Republican Party. Excuse me. And many believed that the small Republican presence allowed Wilson to implement his new diplomacy as part of the Treaty of Versailles. However, major opposition towards the Versailles Treaty came about when Henry Cabot Lodge, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, led 39 other Republicans in a round-robin attack on the conference's secrecy and the treaty itself. Lodge's reservations to the Versailles Treaty included the guarantee of the continuation of the Monroe Doctrine, the right for Congress to declare war, and the disposal of the Shandong Agreement. The Treaty of Versailles rejection, hoping to counterattack the opposition that the Treaty of Versailles was experiencing, as well as securing the implementation of the League of Nations, Wilson embarked on a public speaking tour which covered 8,000 miles in September 1919. The Treaty of Versailles would never gain the two-thirds approval in the Senate, and Wilson, after recuperating from a major stroke that followed his speaking tour, ensured that the Democrats joined the Irreconcilable, a group who highly opposed the treaty in any form, and opposing the version of the treaty that included the Lodge reservations. Ultimately, the reason behind Americans' rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, and of course, the main topic of this presentation, was multifaceted. For one, senators who opposed the treaty opposed it because they felt it would force the United States into countless wars in foreign lands, and two, accepting the treaty, as well as becoming part of the League of Nations, would supplant American sovereignty as the Treaty of Versailles would compel the United States to become involved in the affairs of other nations. Finally, once President Wilson left office, President Harding, the new Republican president, put zero effort in the treaty's revival, ultimately declaring the treaty dead. And by July 2, 1921, Congress officially ended the war with Germany and found a resolution within the Treaty of Berlin, which ultimately gave the United States all the rights it would have had under the Versailles Agreement. What we may try to examine now is, could Europe have been a safer place if the United States participated in the League of Nations and accepted the Treaty of Versailles as is, especially considering the treaty and its strict repercussions for the Germans became the rally cry for Nazi empowerment under Hitler?